Thank you so much, Linnea, and thank you for all that you did to organize this program. Some of you were able to join us earlier in the galleries, and it was such a treat to be able to talk about the art in its three-dimensional form before talking about it in its two-dimensional form. And I'm grateful for those of you who came, and Linnea for all you did to organize. And I'd also like to thank the rest of the team at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, who are all complete pros, unsurprisingly, and have made this all flawless. Well, at least until now. I don't know, I might mess things up, but it's been flawless in its execution. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Carol Soltis, who is a friend I've long admired for her path-breaking and meticulous work on the Peale family, which is a lot of people to conquer knowledge of, because I just always joke and say Charles Wilson Peale and his 853 children, right? So it's been a real treat to get a chance to talk to Carol about our shared passion for early American art. And last but not least, although I teach at Delaware, I live in Philadelphia, so this is my first hometown talk, so I'm very excited to be sharing it with you all tonight. And I just want to make sure, is the sound okay for people in the back? All right, excellent.
Great.
Little,
Great.
how's that? All right, great. So I'm so pleased to be talking about my new book, The Painter's Fire: A Forgotten History of the Artist Who Championed the American Revolution. And I love this cover. I had nothing to do with it, but I absolutely love the cover, and I love it partly for aesthetics and partly because it allows me to joke that I can make my Gen Z children really embarrassed by my nerdiness when I say, "Isn't my cover fire?" And I'm especially delighted that tonight one of my Gen Z children is in the audience, so she is blushing right now with how nerdy her mom is. It's great. Um, but so I think that this cover is a great encapsulation of some of the book because it shows the ships. It's very much a transatlantic history, and the fire is very emblematic of how I think creative people can be and were in the American Revolution, so important to fueling the fire of the spark of liberty in a revolution. So this history of art and politics in the American Revolution takes us to Philadelphia and to how we remember the revolution, particularly through the things we choose to collect and display in archives, historic sites, and museums like this one. But a little contrarily, I'm going to start with a piece of art that no longer exists because it was most likely lost at sea off the coast of Maine. And I'm not going to begin in Philadelphia or New England or Virginia or any of the usual revolutionary suspects. Instead, I'm beginning in London, more precisely in London's Royal Academy of Art. There we go. I'm glad you warned me there was a bit of a lag. Um, so picture the scene. This is the upstairs gallery of London's Royal Academy, much as it would have looked in the year I'm focusing on, 1780. Massive paintings of all shapes, sizes, and subjects, crowded from floor to ceiling. And it included, among other things, new portraits of King George III and his wife, Queen Charlotte, by American artist Benjamin West. And here you see Queen Charlotte's portrait that was in the show. So among the many portraits in here was the debut painting, Entry, by 22-year-old Joseph Wright, a promising award-winning Royal Academy student who was notable for being one of the first Americans to study there. So this was his first splash on the art scene, a very big deal. And although his painting was one of just many portraits in the show, it was one of the most widely remarked upon pieces that year. His entry showed his famous mother, American wax sculptor Patience Wright, modeling a head on her lap. And this is not his portrait, as I mentioned, that's lost. But this is an earlier depiction of her that was published in a popular London magazine. And so her image was widely known around London. She was famous. And this shows her at work modeling the wax figures. And it shows her after she's sort of given birth to the wax figure. And I say that because she was famous for her technique in which she would look at the viewer, sort of lock him or her in her gaze, and she would be modeling the wax head under her skirts while she talked to them, and then whip it out fully formed in this sort of, showmanship impresario move. So anyone who knows anything about sculpture knows this is probably not, she probably didn't start with a, blank piece of wax and move on from there. But she was a showman, and she was famous for this. And so what Joseph Wright showed in his portrait was something just like this. But what she held on her lap was not just any head. It was the decapitated head of King Charles I, England's king famously executed by his own subjects during the English Civil War. And looking on at her work were busts of King George and Queen Charlotte. So bear in mind, not just Benjamin West's portraits of the king and queen were in the show, the king and queen themselves were in the show, attending it because they were its patrons. So obviously, this created a sensation because, as everyone knew, this was a portrait of a regicide and the threat of another regicide. So what's fascinating, though, is reactions to the portrait varied widely. And I'd like to point out, just so this sinks in, this is 1780. This is 5 years after the Battle of Lexington and Concord kicked things off. 5 years on, in London, obviously you have some people who think it's horrible. They say it's an insult, treasonous, that, the artist should be sent to the Tower. But other people, and they put this in the press as well as private letters, say that it's an entertaining, instructive defense of constitutional liberties and that it should be saluted. So these clashing opinions and its remarkable presence at London's Royal Academy at all, I think, reminds us that the war we now call the American Revolution was fought on both sides of the Atlantic, and it was fought by artists as well as soldiers, and in the courts of public opinion as well as on the battlefield. But art, like many things, does not always survive the havoc of history. And Joseph Wright's painting, as I mentioned, was lost. And here I want to give you a sample of his artistic style so you could get a sense of what it might have looked like. Soon after the portrait was displayed at the Royal Academy, he created this self-portrait of himself that was made into a print in which he is clearly capitalizing on the moment, styling himself as Yankee Doodle or the American Satan. And he's surrounded by 2 print copies of portraits that he did that are here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, including on the left a portrait of Benjamin Franklin and on the right a portrait of George Washington. So as you might guess, since he went on to do portraits of these 2 men, he recovered from the scandal. He was fine. But the fact that his portrait of his mother does not survive, I think, reminds us that what is preserved in our museums is only a very small bit of what was once created and seen. Wright's portrait of his mother, for example, survives only in archival documentation like letters and newspapers. The portrait itself must be imagined, for it can't be seen. It likely, as I mentioned, was lost at sea. In 1781, Joseph Wright left London for Paris, and then in 1782, with the help of the Wrights' family friend, Benjamin Franklin, he made plans to return to the United States, sailing on a Boston-bound ship. After a 10-week journey, battling gusts of snow-filled wind on its last day at sea, the ship approached the Maine coast and ran aground on a pile of rocks. Although the passengers managed to make it ashore, much of the ship's cargo, including Wright's paintings, was lost, washed out of the ship's hold, or sunk below the waves. So Joseph Wright's portrait of his mother holding the decapitated head of Charles I may have sunk below the Atlantic, but though it's physically lost, it offers an invaluable window into the revolutionary past. And I'd like to suggest that it's a metaphor for how we can think about history. Because much as we can dive to retrieve shipwrecked things from the bottom of the sea, we can tell histories that allow us to see previously submerged stories about the past. Just because they're submerged or hidden does not mean they're not there. And in The Painter's Fire, I bring these revolutionary portraits up from the depths of the past and into the light. And this allows us to see a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution and the creative people who made it, one that transforms the way we think of the nature of patriotism then and now. So this art and these artists are important to this story because the American Revolution was not just fought here in the colonies with muskets and bayonets. On both sides of the Atlantic, artists armed with paint, canvas, and wax helped create revolutionary ideals. From London to Boston, from Jamaica to Paris, from Bath to Philadelphia, these largely forgotten patriots boldly risked their reputations and sometimes their lives to declare independence. And at the center of The Painter's Fire are the lives of 3 of these remarkable artists that I'm going to focus on today: Robert Edge Pine, Prince Dima, and Patience Wright, Joseph Wright's mother. In part because of who they were, women, men of color enslaved and free, and Britons living in England during the war, these patriot artists were mostly excluded from formal political or military power. Instead, they fired shots against the king on the walls of the Royal Academy and used wax museums to run spy rings. They used their talents to inspire rebellion, define American patriotism, and eventually fashion a new political culture. And together, I think their experiences testify both to the promise of the natural rights ideology of the American Revolution and the limits of the liberty that was actually established in the founding era. So let's take a snapshot look at each of them through some of their surviving work. On the left, you see a portrait of John Penn Jr., which is here in the collections at this museum, by Robert Edge Pine, who was an award-winning British artist, rumored to be of African descent, who infused massive history paintings with politics in Great Britain and then planned to do so in the United States, where he emigrated after the war out of political conviction and opened America's first grand art museum in Philadelphia, with apologies to Charles Wilson Peale, it is true. Prince Dima, on the right, his portrait of his enslaver, Henry Barnes, was the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in America. And he was Robert Edge Pine's pupil in London before self-emancipating and enlisting to fight for the Patriot cause in Massachusetts. And Patience Wright, whose sole surviving full-length wax figure you see in the middle, was a Long Island-born wax sculptor who became a sensation in London, loudly advocating for revolution while acting as an informal patriot spy. So together, these three, their families, and their larger networks, which included famous revolutionary figures like Paul Revere, Ben Franklin, John and Abigail Adams, George and Martha Washington, and Phyllis Wheatley, give us a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution that is fascinating, complex, creative, bizarre, and like a lot of artists themselves, this is a very serious art historical term, wackadoodle. So, Robert Edge Pine is operating in England through the entirety of the American Revolution. And before the Revolution, he already had a reputation of being someone very Republican, little r, egalitarian. He once was an officer of the Society of Artists, which is sort of the more egalitarian precursor to the Royal Society of Art. And he was upset with the president's heavy-handedness, so he resigned in indignation. And then he realized that that was against the bylaws of the organization, so he asked the members to vote him back in and then vote him out so that he could abide by the democratic procedure. So, you know, this is a man devoted to the cause of equality. So here you see some of his portraits that made him famous. On the left, Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay, who is a British woman historian who's famous on both sides of the Atlantic for her massive multi-volume history of Britain, which she's leaning on there. And notice he's painted her wearing a Roman senator's toga. Now, there was never a woman Roman senator in classical ancient Rome. So he's making a point here about how she's the heiress to ancient ideals. And on the right, you see his portrait of John Wilkes, the famous British radical politician who was not afraid to snub the king and his ministers and got imprisoned without due process and the right of habeas corpus, which alarmed many people on both sides of the Atlantic. And these paintings by Pine were made into prints, which means they circulated widely, they were accessible, they were affordable, but they also got made into things like ceramics. There's a little Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay copy of the portrait you can buy. John Wilkes, his portrait by Pine, makes it onto a snuff box, which is in the collections of the PMA. So you could look at Pine's portrait of Wilkes when you took your tobacco in your nose. So what this tells you is that Robert Edge Pine was a popular artist whose paintings were well known. He also, as I mentioned, was likely of African descent. This is his father, John Pine, who is an engraver, good friends with William Hogarth, who painted this portrait of him. And he had royal appointments to George II, a print shop on St. Martin's Lane, and really is the scion of, or is the head of this very well-established multi-generational family of British artists. And they're all centered in St. Martin's Lane. And here you see a depiction of what it would have looked like at the time that Robert Edge Pine was living there. And the house on the top right with the window where you can see a person with a floppy hat working, that is either Pine's house itself or his is the one next door. So this gives you a sense of, you know, the neighborhood in which they're operating. And St. Martin's Lane is more than a street in London. It's really the epicenter of art in the British Empire. And it bustled with artists and artisans, women as well as men. I should mention Robert Edge Pine's wife was also a portrait painter. We have no idea where her paintings went. His daughters, at least two of them, were also practicing artists themselves. More on that in a bit. But it wasn't just painters. It also was famous people like Thomas Chippendale, whose furniture made its way around the Atlantic. And so this was a famous place to go and train if you were an artist or an artisan. And I just want you to picture, this is where Prince Dima, who is enslaved, a former sailor enslaved in Massachusetts, living in Marlborough, where there are all of 5 enslaved people, finds himself brought by his enslavers to London to train with this award-winning British painter, Robert Edge Pine. So you can imagine what this would have been like for Prince Dima to be taken out of Massachusetts and be able to train with Robert Edge Pine. And it's interesting because one of the reasons his enslavers take him to London is that John Singleton Copley in Boston, whom they'd asked to train him, refused to on account of his race. Robert Edge Pine accepted training him, did not even charge his enslavers for it, and said it was on account of his genius. Now, I also think it was on account of their shared African heritage, with which the enslavers probably knew nothing about because unless they'd seen a portrait of John Pine, they would not know that this was the rumor that was circulating around these people. And so while he was training Prince Dima, Robert Edge Pine was working on the 1771 massive history painting. Those of you who are in the gallery, it's like the Benjamin West history painting that we saw. And it became also translated into a print. And I have to wonder if the political decisions that Dima and Pine later both made in relation to the American Revolution means that they exchanged political views while they were working together on this painting, because it was done at the time he was there. So this painting is obscure to us now, but at the time was a famous scene from the year 1278, and I did say that correctly, the 13th century. And it was the Earl of Warenne defending his right to prevent his property from being seized by a tyrannical king without cause. This obviously has some reverberations in the year 1770 and 1771, and this, in fact, is what makes this a popular painting. And so it's intriguing for me to think about their shared political points of view, because even though Christian Barnes, whose portrait by Prince Dima you see here, his enslaver and art patron, um, hopes that she believes that Prince, or as she called him, their Black Hogarth, was of Tory or Loyalist principles, mostly because he was born in their family, she confessed, "Of that I'm not quite so certain, as he has not yet declared himself." So I think her comment is really fascinating because it points to Prince Dima's diplomatic skills at negotiating the complications of sharing a household with these people who have enslaved him, but also are his art patrons. And I think understanding his artistic and political path really starts in the Barnes' household, but not because of his enslavement per se, and not because of Christian Barnes thinking that she's his art patron, but because Christian Barnes is responding to Prince Dima's mother, Daphne. And Daphne is someone who is taken from Africa as a young girl, enslaved, spends the rest of her life um, in Massachusetts, but never forgets that she's from Africa. And the name Dima was either her surname or her given name as a girl in West Africa. And it's very unusual that they hang on to these names, but they do. And she badgers Christian to purchase her son away from, I think he's owned by her brother, the legal trail's a little foggy, because he's been working as a sailor, and she says he's a really talented artist, and if you could only see him, it'd be great to have him here. And so Christian Barnes is intrigued and, in fact, purchases him and encourages his art and his talents. But so I think, so this, Christian Barnes sounding pretty cool, right? She's an enslaver, but she's an art patron. She does things like write about how women should be allowed to do more things outside the house and they can do anything men can do. And you're like, okay, Christian Barnes, you're really interesting. But she's a great reminder that people in the past, like people today, are very complex and very rarely one thing or the other entirely. And I think that you can understand why Prince Dima wouldn't tell her about his politics, which are not hers, because there are three people enslaved in the Barnes household: Daphne, Prince, and a woman called Juliet. Juliet is allowed by Christian Barnes and this man Jack's enslaver to marry. So you can't legally marry as enslaved people in Massachusetts, but if your enslavers allow it, you can cohabitate and call yourselves spouses. They become pregnant. Their first baby, Christian, has encouraged their romance. She lets her give birth in the best room in the house, and Daphne is the midwife. And then when the baby is born, she says, "Sufficient to the day is the evil thereof." And she says, "I need to dispose of this child." So she either sells or gives it away. Jack and Juliet become pregnant a second time, but it's obvious when the baby is born that it's not Jack's because of its complexion, which leads me to believe that it was the act of rape or non-consensual sex with a white man, and Christian Barnes is beside herself at this. Even though Jack and Juliet say, "We don't care, we want to stay together," she is so outraged by this behavior that she not only sells the second baby, but also Juliet, and we have no idea what happens to her. So I think you can imagine why Prince Dima wasn't willing to tell her that he was a patriot-leaning enslaved person living in this Tory household. But Christian Barnes and her husband Henry, whose portrait by Prince Dima you see here, were the staunchest of Tories or Loyalists, and I have to say, they were not hypocrites. So during this time period, a lot of people signed non-importation agreements and sort of continue to smuggle goods, etc. Henry Barnes sticks to his guns. He refuses to sign local non-importation agreements. He ends up lampooned in town meetings in Boston, in newspapers, and things take a violent turn against the Barneses. Men break the windows of a pearl ash works that they own. They attack a wagon full of goods that are hauling the Barneses' property, abuse the driver, and steal the contents. And then the next day, people hang an effigy, so like a dummy, representing Henry Barnes with a paper pinned to its breast, calling him an infamous imposter. Hang it on a hill within sight of the Barnes' household all day, and then burn it at night. And then the same night, the local patriots steal someone's house from a nearby stable, tar the horse, its saddle and bridle, and then mount an effigy on its back, set it loose around the town with a paper pinned to the breast, which wished all the Barneses in hell. So this is the only recorded instance of an animal being tarred and feathered during the Revolutionary era. And if you can picture tar in a horse's hair, you can imagine. And I have no doubt it made a lasting impression on the people who saw it. But I think for those of us looking back in time, it's a really chilling reminder of the violence simmering below the surface and sometimes breaking free in the American Revolution, which I think we like to think of as a natural rights revolution, and all the battles were on the battlefield. And I think part of it is very successful art propaganda, like Paul Revere's famous Boston Massacre print, in which he convinces a lot of people to remember this event as a British firing squad style occurrence, which I'm sure you all know it was not. And so I think we tend to discount this violence, and Christian Barnes and what happened to them is a great reminder of the actual violence that occurs. And if you've been looking at her portrait wondering what is wrong with her chest, what is wrong with her chest is that eventually it gets too much for the Barneses, and they flee and they relocate to England for the rest of their lives. They have to leave their property behind. The Patriots confiscate it. It is given over to the use of their house to Henry and Lucy Knox, which very much upsets Christian because she knows Lucy Knox and she's like, how dare she take my things and my art? And when the Patriot soldiers came to seize the goods, they stabbed a bayonet through Christian Barnes's heart as a symbolic statement. But so Prince Dima, meanwhile, and his mother Daphne stay behind. And Prince Dima had set up shop in Boston. He advertises in Boston newspapers that he's a black man whose extraordinary genius has been assisted by one of the best masters in London. He repeatedly advertises. And he is set up working out of the shop of a watchmaker, John McLean. Now, John McLean lives in a neighborhood that is not far from the State House where the Boston Massacre occurred. It's on King Street. And what's interesting is that Prince Dima is not the only black genius working in this neighborhood, because McLean's shop was also a short walk from the site of where a family called the Wheatleys lived. And of course, these are the Wheatleys of Phyllis Wheatley fame. And Phyllis Wheatley is an interesting part of this story because, like Prince Dima, she goes to London to get her art furthered. She cannot find the financial backing to produce her book of poems, which you see there in Boston. Instead, she has to go to London. And when she goes to London, she brings with her an image of herself that is made into an engraving that becomes the first frontispiece of a black woman in the first book of poems written by a black woman that's published at this time. So in the past, people have said this is the work of Scipio Moorhead, who is another enslaved person, a much younger man, who is living, again, within shouting distance of Prince Dima and Phyllis Wheatley in Boston. And people think that because his enslaver was a woman who trained people in artistic pursuits sometimes. And Phyllis Wheatley wrote a poem to SM, a young African painter, on seeing his works, in which she talks about seeing his genius and seeing his painting. So people have assumed that this unlabeled, unsigned painting is by him. I think it's by Prince Dima because I think if you're as savvy as Phyllis Wheatley, and she was very savvy at managing her own image, as was her enslaver Susanna Wheatley, why would you go with the teenage boy who had had no training whatsoever besides his enslaver, who was an amateur artist, rather than the London-trained painter who was taking out advertisements and the fact that he'd been trained by an award-winning British artist also down the street? So I think this is Prince Dima. But what I think is the most important takeaway about this is we'll never know probably, but I think it's amazing that if it wasn't Prince Dima, it probably was Scipio Moorhead, which means it was a formerly enslaved or currently enslaved black man who does this painting. And it means that you have not one, not two, but three enslaved Black geniuses working in artistic pursuits within shouting distance of one another. And I just like to dwell on this because I think it's an important reminder that these people are not one-offs. They're extraordinary, but they're not unique, and that they are being as creative and using their talents as much as this oppressive system will let them. And I think that it was appreciated by the people who enjoyed the fruits of their creative labors. And I think that partly because here you see a portrait that Prince Dima did of a Scottish merchant living in Boston called William Dogood, and this is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's amazing because it's signed on the back, and I love that it's signed with a sort of large Prince Dima and a teeny tiny Barnes, which I think is a sort of subconscious thing on his part. And what I love about this as well is that the family clearly cherished it, because if you look closely, you'll see he's wearing a brooch, a heart-shaped brooch made of red garnets, which are a jewel that symbolize affection. The brooch was also kept along with the portrait and descended in the family and has ended up at the Met together. And if that's not a testament to how much they loved this portrait, I'm not sure what is. So Prince Dima drops that name Barnes as soon as he can when his enslavers leave. And we know this because he enlists in the Massachusetts militia company known as the Train under the name Prince Dima. So the Train was a famed artillery unit with officers who had long histories of patriot protest, including its second in command, Paul Revere, shown here in his portrait by John Singleton Copley. Its commanding officer was Colonel Thomas Crafts. So Crafts was the person who, when the Declaration of Independence was read out loud in Boston for the first time, stood on the balcony of the State House to read it. So he's a famous figure too. But the officers leading the regiment, Crafts, Revere, and others, have something else really interesting in common besides their politics. They almost all make a living as artisans. So Revere, of course, works as a silversmith and printmaker. Crafts, like Dima, was a painter, but he specialized in japanning furniture. So which would have been similar to this example from Salem that you see here, which was an imitation of Japanese lacquered or Asian lacquered furniture with paint and varnish. And speaks, I think, to the fact that Americans have always wanted things from Asia. This is not a new development. So another officer in the regiment, Joseph Dunkerley, whose miniature here at the PMA you see, was fascinating because he was actually an enlisted British soldier. And when war broke out, he was like, you know, the Americans, their ideals are where it's at. And he deserted the British troops, enlisted to fight in the Train for the Patriots. And he also was practicing his miniature art before, during, and after the war. And oftentimes, he would collaborate with his fellow officer in the Train, Paul Revere, as in this silver frame that surrounds it. So I think this is a fascinating look at how these groups of men are all creative people, also engaged in these military activities together. And as a skilled artisan in himself, Dima would have had a lot in common with the officers in the Train, although they were all white. But he wasn't the only black man in the Train, and he, of course, wasn't the only black man to fight for the Patriots. But it's interesting because when he dies in 1778, which is also the year that his former master, painting master in London, Robert Edge Pine, creates this print, he doesn't choose to remember himself as a soldier. Instead, in his will, he leaves everything to his beloved mother, Daphne Dima, and proudly declared himself to be a free man and a painter. So I do always wonder, though, if he corresponded with Robert Edge Pine during his time in the Train, because they certainly shared political points of view. And during the war, Pine relocated to the city of Bath in England, where there was a pretty active pro-American circle. Catherine Macaulay was there, Robert Edge Pine and his family, George William Fairfax, whose signature you see on that subscription list to help finance the print made off of this painting of Robert Edge Pine's. And George William Fairfax is important to this story because he is someone who is Virginian. Fairfax County is named after his family, so an important Virginian. And he's over in England during the war trying to get a noble inheritance. And like Robert Edge Pine, he constantly has rumors that he is of African descent. His mother was from the Caribbean, and she was widely rumored to be of mixed race. So interesting to think about whether, you know, the men had so many things to talk about in terms of rumors around their family and shared politics. And George William Fairfax writes to George Washington, who's his bestie from Virginia, and says, look, this guy, Robert Edge Pine, there's no truer friend to liberty and the American cause, and he has suffered so much business-wise for his outspoken support of America. through art like this. And he wants to relocate to America after the war's done and paint the great moments of the American Revolution. And you really should have him over. And in fact, George Washington does just that. And more on that in a bit. But before Robert Edge Pine leaves for America, he paints a portrait of Patience Wright, the wax sculptor, whose image you saw to start this talk. And I love it because you can see she's got this sort of bundle of something under her diaphanous cloth on her lap. So I'm like, oh, Robert H. Pine, maybe he has a sense of humor. You know, he's showing that she is, she's at work. So, like Pine, Patience Wright was an avid American patriot. She wasn't shy about her point of view. She was particularly active in favor of American prisoners of war, thousands of whom were kept indefinitely in British prisons at the pleasure of the king because their right to trial was suspended due to the Treason Act of 1777. And among other things, she started spying. She would send letters across the channel to Franklin, and it's hilarious. I've come across these letters by sort of 18th century British MI6 people who are like, we found another one of Mrs. Wright's letter to Franklin, but you know what? We're going to let it go through because she's just got some stuff wrong, and it might actually do our side more good than harm if he thinks that's what's happening. So I don't know how good she was, but she was, she was out there trying. More successful, I think, were the letters that she smuggled in wax heads that she made of famous Britons and shipped across the Atlantic to her sister Rachel, who operated an equally popular wax museum in Philadelphia that was frequented by members of the Continental Congress, among others. John Adams has a wonderful, lengthy description of his visit to the museum, and it's not much to his taste because he feels he's walking among corpses because they are so realistic. But so, in addition to these endeavors, she's operating this super popular wax museum, which gives her the ear of anyone who's anyone. She's done multiple portraits of the royal family, although she is persona non grata when the war begins because she allegedly harangues George to his face about the battles of Lexington and Concord. So she's aided in her waxmaking by her daughters, Elizabeth, who ends up marrying a famous American prisoner of war, and Phoebe, whose portrait you see there on the right. Now, Phoebe, as you might guess from this lovely image, was noted for her beauty, and she posed for artists including Benjamin West in some of his history paintings. So paintings just like this one, which some of you saw in the galleries, upstairs. And so she would have been one of the anonymous Roman figures in here. Another person that she posed for was the historical hottie in the middle there, who is John Hopner, who is a Royal Academy trained artist, rumored to be the illegitimate son of George III, who has been given an allowance by the king his entire life. The king paid for him to go to the Royal Academy. But the day after he marries Phoebe Hopner, daughter of the American spy, with the encouragement of Benjamin West, King George III stops his allowance and cuts him off. So kind of amazing to think about this family and all of their connections. And at their marriage, one of the two witnesses to the event was the niece of Robert Edge Pine. So you can see how they're all sort of connected in these political, artistic family circles. So Phoebe was one of the people who helped her mother make this wax sculpture, which is of William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, which survives. You can go see it today in Westminster Abbey. It is full length, the size of the man, and it's so lifelike. You can see little hairs on the back of its head. And we know Phoebe helped because she put a label inside that said that she was one of the people who helped with it, which I think is great. So he was famously pro-American. I think the Americans thought he was more pro-American than he actually was, but propaganda means everything. And he collapsed after giving an impassioned speech on the House of Lords and died. So these are the robes in which he collapsed and died. So, a very sort of lifelike reminder of him. And Patience Wright wanted to do more than she could. She wrote to John Dickinson that women are always useful in grand events. And I'd like to dwell on this a bit because I think it's a good reminder that Abigail Adams is not the only one saying, remember the ladies, and that many women are asking for greater political participation, more political roles. They want to be active. They are just as ardent patriots as the men in their lives. And this is one reason she does espionage and uses her wax museum as this sort of space to gather intelligence. But she wants to do something wackier. What she wants to do is, and she writes to Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Dickinson about this, she wants to move back to Philadelphia from London after the war, and she wants to make a wax museum of all the important founders and install it in the State House in Philadelphia. So Had she had her point of view, we would have an Independence Hall filled with life-size wax figures of the founders, which, I mean, that would be amazing. So she understood the symbolic and instructive importance of art and politics, but unfortunately she died before she could do this in 1786, after a fall, returning from a visit to John Adams, where she probably was haranguing him yet again. And I don't think Abigail was too happy that she came over to visit so much, because she remembered her as the Queen of Sluts. So we can go into that more in the Q&A if you'd like. So at the time of her death, Robert H. Pine was in America, busy collecting portraits for the same type of endeavor. He wanted to make history paintings. But one of the things he was doing was painting a lot of portraits instead of history paintings to finance his career there. George Washington on the left, he painted. Martha Washington commissioned him to paint numerous portraits of her grandchildren and niece, and you see one of her grandchildren on the right there. And one of the reasons that Robert H. Pine is so prolific is that his daughters, at least two of them, who later exhibit at the Royal Academy in London, help him with this. So you see his daughter Charlotte there on the left. What they do is Robert H. Pine paints the head, cuts it out of the canvas, and then glues it onto a larger canvas, and they come in and do the rest of it. So he can be out collecting the thing from life, and they're just sort of zhuzhing the edges. So I think this portrait of Robert Morris really shows that technique. And since Robert H. Pine's art has not been that valued, art historically speaking, over time, some of the examples in collections have not been well conserved, and they're really popping off the back, and it's kind of amazing. Not amazing from an art conservation perspective, but amazing from a historical perspective. But so Robert Morris was really important to him because, among other things, he becomes his art patron in America. And so I think that you can see, too, that even though we're kind of laughing at this technique, Robert H. Pine was the most famous, most award-winning artist to live in America at the time that he lived in America. Washington was so excited that they scored Robert H. Pine. And I think you can understand why when you think about his portrait of Martha Washington's grandchild versus the feral children in the 18th century John Wollaston, which is a portrait of her children. So if that's the portrait you have of your kids hanging in the parlor, you're very excited to get that instead. So, and thanks to financier Robert Morris, Robert H. Pine is actually able to open a grand art museum in a bespoke space. Robert Morris built him a mansion. The entire second floor is a gallery. And it includes all sorts of things, like the massive history paintings he was working on, lots of scenes of Shakespeare. Here's a print at the PMA that is copied after one of his Shakespeare paintings. I think it does show David Garrick, the famous actor, down there. When Houdin, the French sculptor, came to leave some of his busts in America, he kept the Franklin bust, that's also at the PMA, on display at Robert H. Pine's museum for a while. It had the first Venus de Milo in America, a copy, which was a little bit scandalous. And what I love about this is that Rembrandt Peale specifically said that compared to the small gallery his father operated in their home at the time, when I entered Mr. Pine's spacious saloon, I was astonished at its magnitude and the richness of the paintings which covered its walls. So this isn't something that gets covered usually when we talk about the artist in his museum, the famous Peale. But Robert H. Pine also dies before he can accomplish his dreams, and most of his history paintings are destroyed in a fire, weirdly alongside most of the wax figures that survive from the Wright women. So one that survives is his unfinished Congress Voting Independence, which Edward Savage later copied into a print. And if you look at it, the architecture is remarkably realistic in terms of the interior of what we now call Independence Hall. And I just like to think about how our understanding of the revolution and its patriots might have been altered had more of his art survived, and had more of Patience Wright's art survived, and had Prince Dima continued to keep making art long after the war ended. So we would have a gallery of lifelike colored wax figures of founders to rival Madame Tussauds. And just as one example, here's a print made of Charles Willson Peale's painting of William Pitt. And then just contrast the feel you get from interacting with that versus how you feel interacting with her wax figure of William Pitt. We'd have portraits by a formerly enslaved man who was also, like Trumbull, a London-trained patriot artist, a military veteran. And I think the art of these three people would have created a very different visual memory of the American Revolution. And as one example, compare Robert H. Pine's Congress voting independence to Trumbull's far more famous one. So the intertwined lives of the patriots in this book remind us that the popular image of a patriot in the American Revolution, of a white man writing a political pamphlet or leading a battle charge within the continental United States, tells only part of the story. Revolutionary era patriotism was far more cosmopolitan, geographically broad, and diverse than we often remember it to be. The patriots who dedicated themselves to the cause of American liberty included Black and mixed race people, women, people from outside what became the national borders of the United States, and people who practiced idiosyncratic politics through art, popular culture, and espionage. And as we approach the nation's 250th birthday next year, the lives traced in this book remind us that we must continue to revise our collective memory about who American patriots were, what they looked like, where they fought, and with what weapons. And I think if we seek to reimagine what patriotism meant during the American Revolution, how important art was to its politics, we can better understand their world. But I think it also allows us to come together in places like this museum so we can have conversations about the past that can move us forward together as a diverse nation.